Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. One of the key and central topics that William James is going to approach and explore and actually take an important stand on in his address, The Will to Believe, is the connection between what he calls certitude, which you could also translate as certainty, and truth itself. And this is going to start in section 5, where he says that the faith that truth exists and that our minds can find it may be held in two ways. We may talk about the empiricist and the absolutist way of believing in truth. And notice that he's using the word belief there, right? Not saying that we absolutely have knowledge. That's going to come a little bit later. He also uses this term faith, right? So this is quite important. And so there's different ways of doing this. He says that the absolutists in this manner say that we not only can attain to knowing truth, but we can know when we have attained to knowing it. So we can have knowledge about our own state of knowledge, whilst the empiricists think that although we may attain it, we cannot infallibly know when. And that infallibly, there's a very important qualifier. He's not saying that we can't know that we know something if we're an empiricist. He's just saying we can't infallibly know that we know the truth in, most circumstances, right? And so he goes on and he says, to know is one thing, and to know for certain, there's that certitude, that we know is another. You can hold to the first being possible without the second. And so they show very different degrees of dogmatism in how they approach the truth. Empiricists are less dogmatic, and absolutists are more dogmatic, right? So then he's going to talk about what he calls scholastic orthodoxy. Now, does this only mean scholasticism of the Middle Ages, early modern period, late modern period, as we might find, say, among certain Thomists? No. This covers a lot of ground. You could be a scholastic orthodox subscribing person from a variety of different viewpoints. So he says, scholastic orthodoxy, to which one must always go when one wishes to find a perfectly clear statement, has beautifully elaborated this absolutist conviction in a doctrine which it calls that of objective evidence. And then he says, if, for example, I'm unable to doubt that I now exist before you, that 2 is less than 3, or if all men are mortal, then I am mortal too, it is because these things illumine my intellect irresistibly. And then he's going to launch into some Latin phrases here, which I'll translate for you because maybe you don't know Latin. He's assuming an audience that actually does know it as his address. He says that the final ground of this objective evidence possessed by certain propositions is the adequatio intellectus nostri cum re. So the adequation or the correspondence between our intellect with the thing, the matter itself. And then he says, the certitude it brings involves an aptitudinem ad extorquendum certum assensum on the part of the truth envisaged. So what is that? A aptitude or disposition to demanding, to imposing, to bringing out of it a certain assent, not certain as like a kind of assent, but an absolutely certain assent on the part of the truth envisaged, and on the side of the subject, a quietem in cognitione, right? If we want to be very literal about this, a quiet but resting in the cognition, the knowledge that it has. When once the object is mentally received, that leaves no possibility of doubt behind, and the whole transaction operates nothing but the entitas ipsa of the object and the entitas ipsa of the mind, the entity itself, the being, the what makes it what it is of the object and what makes the mind what it is. Okay, so, this could be that of Thomistic scholasticism, but this could also be so many others as well. Do we ever really have something like this? And he says, we slouchy modern thinkers dislike to talk in Latin. Indeed, we dislike to talk in set terms at all, but our own state of mind is very much like this when we uncritically abandon ourselves. And so people may pretend that they're skeptics or empiricists, but they're never truly such. And it's very easy to believe, as he says, in something like this objective evidence. He says, the greatest empiricists among us are only empiricists on reflection. When left to their instincts, they dogmatize like infallible popes. And he talks about Clifford, somebody who he's targeting in this, telling us how sinful it is to be Christians on such insufficient evidence. Insufficiency is really the last thing they have in mind. For them, the evidence is absolutely sufficient, only it makes it the other way. They believe so completely in an anti-Christian order of the universe, there's no living option, right? So, we're very often, even if we claim to be empiricists, we fall into absolutism. And something like this notion of objective evidence or certainty or certitude or something along those lines. Now, in the next section, number 6, he'll say, okay, if we are such absolutists by instinct, what should we do as philosophers? Should we endorse this? Should we treat it as a weakness of our nature? And James says, I sincerely believe the latter course is the only one we can follow as reflective men. Objective evidence and certitude are doubtless, as he's going to call it, fine ideals to play with, but where are they to be found? And so he says, I am going to be a complete empiricist as far as this matter goes, right? I'm going to endorse empiricism as far as my theory of human knowledge goes. And so how is this going to work? Well, he's going to say, what can we actually be completely certain about? And he says, the only thing that Pyrrhonian skepticism, so the most extreme form of skepticism, leaves behind is one indefectibly certain truth. And what is it? The present phenomenon of consciousness exists. So this goes even beyond Descartes' I think, therefore I am, which is the Archimedean point, as he calls it, by which he can reconstruct everything else. Turns out that Descartes actually believes in a whole bunch of other things that he's using to reconstruct the world in his own form of skepticism. So James is saying this is the only thing that you can be like totally certain of in that way. And he goes on and he says, that's fine. We can have that, but that's the bare starting point of knowledge, the mere admission of a stuff to be philosophized about. So the different philosophies are attempts at expressing what this stuff, what it is that we're philosophizing about, really is, and what happens when we actually go to our libraries. Can we find a certainly true answer? And he says, well, aside from propositions, and here's an example of one, that 2 plus 2 are equal to 4, or we could use the earlier 2 is less than 3, mathematical propositions. So he says, apart from abstract propositions of comparison, propositions which tell us nothing by themselves about concrete reality. Now, he's not saying that you can't apply mathematics to concrete reality. By themselves, those propositions don't tell us anything about the world we experience, right? They are abstract. So he goes on and he says, aside from these, we find no proposition ever regarded by anyone as evidently certain. So there's all sorts of propositions that people have found to be evidently certain to them. And they put them forward as if they were to everyone. So we find no proposition that has not either been called a falsehood or at least had its truth sincerely questioned by someone else. So this is a problem, right? Every claim about this objective evidence or, absolute certainty that every reasonable human being can recognize winds up being contested if we're being honest with ourselves, if we're being empiricists and looking at the history of ideas, if we're going through the library and opening up books and seeing what people are actually saying and then what other people are saying about that. So that should be, a significant issue, right? Especially when we see people making claims about objective evidence and certainty. So that's, an example. He says, the transcending of the axioms of geometry and the rejection of the whole Aristotelian logic by the Hegelians are great examples of this. And we could multiply even more examples of this. And then he says, no concrete test of what is really true has ever been agreed upon. And he's going to give us a whole bunch of examples of this. What are they? Some make the criterion external to the moment of perception, putting it in revelation, right? It's in some religious text, or the consensus gentium. Now, the consensus gentium is an old-fashioned way of talking about everybody believes this, or everybody who's reasonable believes this. And it was used, for example, as a very weak argument for the existence of God or the gods or the divine, all the way back in Cicero's time, because Cicero puts it in the mouth of one of his interlocutors in On the Nature of the Gods. It's a terrible argument, right? It could be that everybody is wrong about that. Or the instincts of the heart, right? That's something extra rational. The systematized experience of the race. He's talking about, people who are kind of sloppy, loose social Darwinists, or pick whatever else you want. Others make the perceptive moment its own test. So, for example, Descartes, with his clear and distinct ideas guaranteed by his veracity of God. Not everybody buys that, including, some of James' own contemporaries, like Charles Peirce, for example. Thomas Reid with his common sense. Man, anytime you see an appeal to common sense, you know that somebody is kind of like at the limits of what it is that they're trying to justify, because it's not a very good ground at all. Kant with his forms of synthetic judgment a priori. Kant thinks that everybody has to buy into this. You don't have to. And his successors didn't necessarily do that. So he says the inconceivability of the opposite, the capacity to be verified by sense, the possession of complete organic unity or self-relation, a Hegelian approach to it, realized when a thing is its own other. All of these are standards that have been used. None of them actually have anything even close to universal assent. If we look through the history of philosophy, every single one of them not only has been, as he says, contested by somebody, there's a whole bunch of people who say this is not actually even true. So that's a big problem, isn't it? There's no concrete test that has universal consensus. So what does this mean? He says this objective evidence, never triumphantly there. It is, as he says, a mere aspiration or Grenzbegriff. Now, a Grenzbegriff, a limit concept, this is a German term that was used quite a bit. Something that you can't actually meet with. This is actually, you can find this in Kant, for example, and in so many of his successors. So this objective evidence that we say is there doesn't turn out to really be there. Every one of these things is rather subjective. This is starting to look pretty bad, isn't it? And he'll go on and say, here we go. What a contradictory array of opinions have objective evidence and absolute certitude been claimed. And so here's a listing of examples. And we could add so many other examples to this. The world is rational through and through. Its existence is an ultimate brute fact. Those can't both be true at the same time. People have maintained them as if they are, absolute certainties. There is a personal God. A personal God is inconceivable. Again, two things that can't possibly both be true. Maybe they're both wrong, right? There's an extramental physical world immediately known. The mind can only know its own ideas. Same sort of deal. A moral imperative exists. Obligation is only the resultant of desires. A permanent spiritual principle is in everyone. There are only shifting states of mind. There is an endless chain of causes. There is an absolute first cause. An eternal necessity, a freedom. A purpose, no purpose. A primal one, a primal many. A universal continuity, an essential discontinuity in things. An infinity, no infinity. There is this, there is that, there is indeed nothing which someone has not thought absolutely true, while his neighbor deemed it absolutely false. So these examples cover the gamut of epistemology, metaphysics, moral philosophy, philosophy of religion. We could have gone into politics. We could have gone into aesthetics. We could pick anything that you want. And somebody is going to say, this is absolutely true. And then there's somebody else who's like, nope, don't buy into it. You're wrong about that. But this over here is absolutely true. Quite often, they're going to jump from one certitude to another. Why is James giving us all these examples? Because he wants to drive this point home to us, right? So he goes on and says, here we go. Every single one of these things has been, considered to be true by some person, and somebody has contested it. Not an absolutist among them seems ever to consider that the trouble may be essential. This may be, in fact, endemic to our use of the human mind in relation to our experience and generalizing about the way things are and about how well we can know them. And so he says, the intellect, even with truth directly in its grasp, may have no infallible signal for knowing whether it be truth or not. So we can have truth, but it doesn't seem as if we can have objective evidence or absolute certainty that it is indeed true. And even if we can have the feeling of it or the belief in it subjectively for ourselves or with a bunch of our own, people that agree with us, that we hang out with, that we read books together with in some sort of school or tradition or some sort of approach to things. The fact that there's others who say, no, that doesn't work, that's a problem for us, isn't it? So he says, all right, what are the implications of this? Should we all become skeptics and say, there's no truth whatsoever, we can't know anything other than, for example, that consciousness, the phenomenon of consciousness exists in the present? James says, no, we don't have to get so pessimistic about things from there. He says, when as empiricists we give up the doctrine of objective certitude, we don't give up, and notice these two words, the quest or the hope of truth itself. And I think those are very important. Hope, something that we can't say we have absolute certainty in, but hope is what allows us to do some of what he's talking about later on in it, to engage in the kinds of action and decision that would allow us to actually come across certain truths. And it has to be a quest. We continue trying to seek the truth, even if we recognize that when we find it, we're probably not going to be absolutely certain about it. And even if we feel that we're absolutely certain, somebody else is going to say, nah, that's not absolutely certain, and its opposite is absolutely certain. He says we still pin our faith on its existence, truth's existence, and we still believe we gain an ever better position towards it by systematically continuing to roll up experiences, so paying attention to things and having experiences, and think. Now, here's what he says that's really quite important. Our great difference from the scholastic, the absolutist, lies in the way we face. Now, what it means there is what direction we're looking, where we are taking our focus. And he talks about a difference between a terminus a quo and a terminus ad quem. Again, Latin terms, right? Terminus, an end, a goal, and a quo, from which, right? So our starting points, you could say, and then ad quem, where we're going. So the absolutist, as he's going to say, the strength of his system lies in the principles, the origin, the terminus a quo of his thought. What makes him certain is that he began from the right starting points, and then he began deducing things or whatever other mode of inference he's using to get to some results. Now, James says that the empiricist, and here you can recognize that the empiricist is also a pragmatist. He says the strength is in the outcome, the upshot, the terminus ad quem. Not where it comes from, but what it leads to is to decide. We want to see where things are going, what sort of results they produce for us, and that is what allows us to say the things are true, perhaps without an absolute certitude behind them. Now, there is one other thing that he says in a later section at the very end of the work in section 10 that we want to attend to. So he uses this metaphor of a bell, right? He says that if we had an infallible intellect with its objective certitudes, we might feel ourselves disloyal to such a perfect organ of knowledge in not trusting to it exclusively, in not waiting for its releasing word. But if we are empiricists, if we believe that no bell in us tolls to let us know for certain when truth is in our grasp, then it seems a bit of idle fantasticality. What a great word he coins there. To preach so solemnly our duty of waiting for the bell, a criterion within ourselves. He says, if we want to, we can wait for it. I'm not saying that you can't wait for it. I'm not denying that. But if we do so at our own peril as much as if we believed. So we don't have to wait for absolute certainty or objective evidence or whatever other turn of phrase you want to use to convey that same idea. Something that, as he points out, is just a limit concept or an aspiration. We don't have to wait for that in order to actually say that we do attain to truth, that we do, in fact, know things. But we need to recognize our own limitations and not pretend as if we have discovered the infallible way of arriving at all truths and that all others must recognize this, because they're not going to. The history of ideas has shown us that that ain't going to be the case. Never has been, never will be. Is that something we can be absolutely certain about? I leave that for you to think about whether James is asserting that with perfect certainty or not.